There's nothing like a field trip or a walkabout read to make it all real, is it? And in terms of on the bus and one of the conversations I had, I'd just like to refresh my memory now in terms of our mix of people. Because I mean, at the last stop, we emphasized the importance of having the building inspector. Kate, that was one of our successes in Couch. We had building inspectors from 5 jurisdictions, didn't we? Yeah, all 5, right? And it did influence the discussion. So I know Comox, for example, had engineering, planning, pardon me? And building inspector, right? Yeah, so you had three there. In addition to Kate and to Marvin, what other planners do we actually have in the room today? And you're with?
Courtney.
Courtney?
Comox.
And Comox. Well, okay, so Comox was 2 planners. Very good. Any other planners? The 1 building inspector. So everybody else, oh, and Vivian, you're architect.
I'm planning.
And planning, right. So is everybody else then basically engineering centric? Fisheries. Okay, good. So we had a bit of a mix. So if you've enjoyed today and you're coming back next time, again, our challenge to you is to bring some of your colleagues because, and I think even Tom, you made a comment or two on the walkabout, which is the importance of this whole thing is to actually have the conversations amongst the departments, right? And so, you know, if you had a good time and you learned something and you think you're going to learn something next time, then bring your colleagues up. So, enough on this. In terms of this wrap-up segment, again, we're starting to prepare the way for the next 2. And this theme, to get to the big picture, it starts with the small pieces. By number 3, we will be into a regional context, won't we, Kevin and Derek? But you need to have the building blocks, right? The next section will be the tools. So very quickly, very high level, I'm just going to weave a quick story here with the Stormwater Guidebook, performance targets, and the water balance model, and Kate's going to help me out to wrap it up in a few minutes. So you'll see that thanks to Kate, who had some leftovers from the Couch event, there's a number that are distributed on your table, so if there's more people than there are guidebooks at your table, then you'll have to fight over who gets it, but at least we've given it to you. The key to that document was when we set out to write it, and I was the project manager and the principal writer of that document, was we were thinking of outcomes, right? So engineers tend to want to be output oriented. Well, I mean, I guess it's part of the job, isn't it? Because if you're doing design and you're doing, you got to do all those calculations, but moving the focus away, not just the calculations, but what do we want? And that became a bit of a theme of conversations I heard, like Marvin, right? You got to know, what do you want? And that's really what the Guidebook tells you to do. And what we want is creating livable communities, protecting stream health. As you saw from the walkabout, you got to think about those little details. And again, the contrast between the 2 ponds and reflects different objectives, right? Because Kevin, one reflected an early 1990s thinking in terms of a park. The other one represented a more recent thinking in terms of what it should look like. Same function, but different goal, different shared vision. So when it was published in 2002, this is in 1 page. This is what you can learn. It provided direction, and now we have the benefit of looking back 6 years. That's the significance. Providing direction and science-based, because it brought together the Washington State biology with our British Columbia hydrology. And it was the way you integrated the 2. And then the guidance on how to do integrated planning, but a lot of times people don't really care about the integration or the integrated planning because you're too focused on your immediate priorities. But that's what it provided. From a technical point of view, it introduced these core concepts. The rainfall spectrum. There's more than 1 rainfall day in a year. The whole retain, detain, convey integrated strategy, and I'll show you a graphic in a moment. The water balance methodology in 2002 was radical thinking and performance targets. That was our big push, having a basis for performance targets and a learn by doing. Unless you build things, unless you look, engineering is about building things. And how did the Romans get it right? Well, they just kept building bridges until one stood up, didn't they? Or aqueducts. So what's learning by doing? So again, when you think about performance targets, I'm going to start zeroing in now. To be implemented and effective, it has to support a desired outcome. It's not just the number. That's why the outcome is what do you when Sandy pointed out the bus window and said, "This is where the water comes from," and this is going into the estuary here. this is why we're doing it, right? That's the outcome. It's got to synthesize complexity. That's one of the things that when we talked about developing the guidebook, we said, people don't understand complexity. You've got to give them simplicity. So we had to give them a number that meant a lot of things. And it's got to be quantifiable, right, Tom? And it's got to be practical. It's got to be flexible, and you got to have a feedback loop, and you got to incorporate learn by doing. That's the essence of what comes out of that document you've got. Why runoff volume or percentage? Because in local government, you actually have control over that. If you're thinking of a creek and walking down a creek and doing your benthic and sampling, and you get numbers here which show instead of your BI benthic index being the desired 40, you got 10. Well, what does that mean? How do you correlate it? Well, the one thing you can measure is what water leaves, or what water comes in, what water leaves. So it's something that through your policies and your practices you have control over. Remember, I took you through Andy Reese's paradigms and said, build a vision, create a legacy. What does it need? It was right out of the guidebook, and we said, first of all, it had to be credible. The approach had to be science-based, but it's all about creating a shared vision of what's achievable, right, Pete? And this next point is really reinforcing why the success of this kind of series depends on having the departments here, because it is about participation in terms of the decision process. It is about getting consensus, and that's what we were doing in the Council series, in terms of having everybody in the room hearing the same message, coming out of the same language, so they were consistent front counter in dealing with the community and with developers. And then at the end of the day, commitment from everyone, including Tom, to truly integrate. Well, remember your comment to me about the integration. Tell us what your joke was about planners and engineers. Come on. Put you on the spot.
There's only 2 planners, so engineers' job is to fix all the problems that the planners create.
But I mean, but he wasn't that blunt. I mean, you did preface it by talking about the integration with the land use planning, right? That you got to know ahead of time what the consequences are. So that's really what we're talking about. But it came through. So,
Again, just an interesting point there.
Yeah.
It goes back to the whole kernel of what we're talking about, is working
collaboratively.
So if we all get together around the table before we start doing anything, then there's no problem fixed.
Exactly. Tom was nodding his head.
Exactly. There needs to be more recognition of the impact of land use.
Yes. And that's the hard, that was this, in terms of back in 2002, that was the significance of the guidebook by saying it starts with the land use. And that was my personal, the time saying to people, if you're dealing with council, what do they deal with on a daily basis on Monday or Tuesday nights? They're dealing with the individual piece of property. They're not dealing with the big picture. So why are we talking about the big picture in all of our watershed planning documents? Because that's not reality. But now that we kind of got our act together in terms of saying, but if you understand what the big picture is and where you're trying to get to, then when you're playing with those small pieces, you can figure out how to get there. And that's but you only get through integration, collaboration, and vision, and innovation, right? So the 4 words, right? Beyond the guidebook. Okay? So it's all about changing the way we develop land. That's what we're talking about. Beyond the guidebook is a very thin document, which is really laying out the philosophical framework of where we're going with things like the new water balance model. I'm also going to point out in your list of web references, there's an 8-pager that says called An Introduction to the Guidebook. So it's really great when you have 6 years later because you kind of look back in terms of the lessons learned, and so the purpose of the introduction then is to hit the basic highlights in terms of what you should be getting out of the guidebook. And I was thinking back to some of the comments you made, Kate, which is you don't expect everybody in this room to read the guidebook from cover to cover.